Welcome, everyone. I had prepared a few notes here, but I just realized that they break all of Joanna's rules. So I'll try to pivot to something more aligned with the catalog of principles that we need to follow. It is a real pleasure to welcome you all to NYU Law, to the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, and to Forge. Some of you attended our first conference 18 months ago, late 2023, and it was a different moment, not because everything was going right, but because we were kind of at in the transition from the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the UN Declaration to something that felt very uncertain. It was kind of an open-ended horizon, and that was the theme of Forge 2023. We literally, when I gave the opening remarks, I said that we were trying to look back to look forward. And that's exactly what we did, and we did it with an amazing group of practitioners and scholars. We had keynotes with very prominent indigenous leaders of the climate movement, with Hilary Charlesworth, who's now at the ICJ, and a number of grassroots activists, practitioners, scholars, who are all here trying to think about the next 75 years. So fast forward 18 months, and here we are. So we had initially, with the decisive contribution of Yusuf Farhad, who's the center's executive director, and who was instrumental to the organization and to the execution of Forge 2023, and is now, of course, an absolutely essential part of the work that the CSRGJ does. Now, of course, with the benefit of Joanna, who just like from the intro remarks, you can tell how much of a blessing she's been to the center so far. And here's Yusuf. I was acknowledging Yusuf's key role in Forge 2023 and in this new edition of Forge. And especially, Yusuf and Joanna were absolutely instrumental in helping me pivot to this new program. We literally, and I know that you all know, that we pivoted to a completely different format and program 1 month ago. So on Monday, I reached out to Yusuf and Joanna, and I said, there's no way that we can hold the type of conference that we held in 2023, right? We can do it, we can go through the motions, and people, because you're all good sports, because you all submitted powerful pitches, we would have been able to pull it off. But it wouldn't have been helpful, it wouldn't have felt right. And if there's one thing that Meg and Philip and the leadership of CHRGJ, certainly myself, want to contribute to this field is to be of service, to be useful. So this is the reason we're convening here, is because this is a convening space to get together, at least for now. And it's not about CHRGJ, it's not about the Forge. So with that pivot, of course, we realized that we'd have to turn to our colleagues and friends like Elisa and Meg and ask them to step down from the role of keynotes, right? They should have been, and they are amazing speakers. Each of them could have given the type of TED Talk that we had asked them to give, on their sleep. And it would have been amazing. And this is why we're so thankful that both Elisa and Meg and everyone who was invited as plenary speakers immediately said yes to the pivot. And this is why this turned into a conversation. And I wanted to start that conversation and turn it over to Elisa and Meg, whose bios are on the program. I don't want to spend too much time or not time at all in introducing their very remarkable bios. But I'm going to turn it over to them to speak about the theme of this panel. In a world where the architecture of human rights that was already fraying in 2023 seems to be, crumbling down in many places, who's left, right? Who is left as an ally? And of course, the beauty of having Meg and Elisa here is that they're both academics and practitioners, and now they have these prominent roles in the UN system as rapporteurs, in the case of Meg, for the independence of judges and lawyers, in the case of Elisa, on climate change and human rights. So ostensibly quite different fields, but dealing with pretty much, it's common issues of which countries can they work with. When you go to the on missions or to Geneva or to the COPs, what type of alliances, what type of connections are meaningful at this time? So with that, I'll turn it over to perhaps simply because, well, Meg is a dear colleague and a local here, so I'll turn it over to Meg first.
Thanks so much, Cesar. And good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that I started with my note of exhaustion, but because we are being honest and I think connecting authentically, it is an exhausting moment. So I was asked to say not make 1 point, but 3 points. And so really briefly, I'm going to give a diagnosis, a kind of set of clarity, and then hopefully a moment of hope. And I'm going to do this from the perspective of my mandate, since I thought that was why I was invited. So this is really going to be about how legal systems are being attacked and deployed right now. So the diagnosis is about autocratization. Sorry, it sounds jargonistic, but we all know exactly what that is. I know many of you are experts at autocratization, sadly, and resisting it effectively. So in terms of independent judicial systems, there are 4 ways that autocrats and kind of would-be autocrats are attacking independent judicial systems. And I'm just going to lay these out really quickly. I'm not going to talk extensively, but I think they're useful right now. So the first is very common, we know it, it's capturing, right? So leaders try to capture the judiciary, they try to put in loyal judges, they try to capture all of the other pieces of the justice system, prosecutors, even bar associations, something that I'm particularly concerned about in the US right now. The second is they're curbing those systems' power to check them. So they are starving independent judiciaries of money. They are threatening, and here again in a US example, they're threatening to sell off courthouses. Yes, that is happening. They are shutting down security services for judges, lawyers, prosecutors. They are threatening to cut off resources, and we've seen with USAID, cutting resources of community justice workers who make justice real in communities. So that's the curbing. The third is attacks that we would look at not at the institutional level, but the individual level. So instrumentalizing the people who they have put into those systems to criminalize human rights defenders, but also to criminalize judges, lawyers, prosecutors, community justice workers. And community justice workers are often the canary in the coal mine here because they're the most vulnerable to this. So we've seen a really enormous criminalization of community justice workers around the world. I'm talking about community paralegals, people who work to accompany their communities to seek justice in a variety of ways. So criminalization is huge, but we're also seeing, as I said, judges and lawyers being criminalized directly. The final one is weaponizing. Unfortunately, right now, the term weaponizing has been weaponized even. But weaponizing here, what I mean is the use of facially illegitimate efforts. So often starting with denigration, singling out, just calling out individual justice workers. And that often happens online. They'll be denigrated, labeled as terrorists, labeled as criminals, labeled as corrupt, et cetera. And then there's a winking or an acquiescence in that turning into then real life harassment and attack. And often you see people be physically attacked or even ultimately killed. That is my diagnosis. So my diagnosis is this is happening in every region, and I can tell you because I've had more than 200 individual communications in the last just a little bit over 2 years from my mandate. which is a lot. It's really a lot coming in of each of these kinds. So that's the first. The second piece is clarity. I hope I'm not talking for too long. So the second piece is clarity. So I think populism and autocratization really depend on instrumentalizing these very deep fissures and inequalities that we all have been working on in the human rights movement for so long. But they instrumentalize those by turning folks against the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and looking for these great leaders to step up. And in the judges and lawyers side of this, judges are made to be elite people who are standing apart from the people and made out to really be enemies of the people in many places. Lawyers are seen as predatory manipulators, that they are people who are only out for themselves. And of course, community justice workers are labeled as communists or as dissidents, words that are very contextual and linked to whatever the process is. Okay, now, what's the hope then? The hope is that these underlying fault lines that many of us are working directly on are things we now can't turn away from. It's impossible to address this populist attack and to recuperate some sense of a fair rule of law, like a real, true access to justice for all, not going back to some kind of order where access to justice is only for a certain set of the population, but to really think hard about how can we transform justice systems to make them truly fair. And I think that means we have to look at the things that are happening that give us hope. So a couple things from my mandate that are giving me hope. First, I think that the whole idea of justice, not war, so this is the Ben Ferencz statement after Nuremberg, is actually being put into action in certain ways. So states and UN institutions are going to the International Court of Justice and seeking advisory opinions on climate change, of course, and on the occupied Palestinian territory. They have been seized with direct cases between states. Of course, I'm thinking of South Africa versus Israel, but also Gambia versus Myanmar and many others. So that's very promising. Secondly, the ICC. So the ICC is under attack, right? It literally has been, well, its chief prosecutor has been sanctioned. And yet, we see not only the arrest warrants against two very top leaders in Israel for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, but also Duterte is now in the hands of the ICC, which is a huge thing that's been fought for by grassroots communities for so long. I'm almost done. And then I think at the very, very local level, and this is the key, very real successes for community justice workers. So I think and this is, I hope that we'll hear about this from folks here from Namati and also from the Fund for Global Human Rights, who've been really crucial to this. But we're seeing people start to see that communities can have access to the law directly. They can use the law, they can learn about it, know about it, use it, shape it, change it, make it more just, make it more fair. And judges can start to be more resilient and more responsive to people in the community. And that is a huge ray of hope. And so is I think the regard we need to have for other justice systems. And here I'm just finishing up a report on Indigenous people's justice systems. And I think they have so much to teach us about what is of value. And we need to then insist on respect for those justice systems as well as the kind of ordinary mainstream. I will stop here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Elisa. And thank you so much, Cesar, for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Meg. Thanks so much. Elisa?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I agree, conversations are just so much more powerful than speeches. So I'm really grateful for that turn. And I think I share my three ideas, which are mainly about resistance, but they are, I think, also part of the diagnosis. Maybe the current geopolitics are a response. There are clear pushback to meaningful progress that resistance has made already. And so we just need to fully understand where is it that we were going right, so much right that we are created this fear in the most powerful and these terrible, cruel responses? And where do we need to keep going and going in a much more connected way than we have so far? So to me, the first thought about resistance is about transformation theories and practices. Transformation tells us that systemic change, which we know we need in the current planetary crisis, does not happen from the top down. It happens from the bottom up. It happens from islands of innovations that connect with one another and create a new system that takes over. And that means that we already have new connections among social movements. I'm thinking about the children's rights movement, climate justice movement, indigenous people's rights movement. But every time I go to COP or other, also in Geneva, I don't see those movements being fully connected, fully strategizing together. They're still each knocking separately at different doors of power. And this makes it easier for those doors to stay closed. But fundamentally, they're all asking the same question, even if coming from different distinctive spaces and needs and diverse, I think, needs for protection of human rights. But for that to be the transformation, the systemic transformation we need connecting of those islands. And that connection happens at the local level and then across scales. And so I wasn't so much planning to work with national governments anyway, my mandate, and I think now it's very clear all of us need to work with cities, with subnational governments, those parts of governments that can't not respond to the planetary crisis because they are at the forefront. And they may have maybe much less resources, but more openness, and they are closer to those with the lived experiences of the disproportionate human rights impacts of climate change and other planetary crises. They're within earshot, and they have the opportunity of learning from those lived experiences and shaping solutions with those most affected, meaningful solutions that are and can be transformative. The second, I think, part of resistance is how finally, from a scientific perspective, we're understanding how we all need to learn from indigenous sciences, knowledge, justice systems. Last year, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services completed a global assessment of science on transformative change. And the key findings was that we all need to learn from indigenous sciences, the understanding of the holistic interconnections between so many dimensions, all dimensions of human well-being, and planetary well-being, from bacterial level to global planetary cycles of water, of carbon, production of oxygen. It's all relational, it's all reciprocal, it's all about care and regeneration. And the other sciences, the natural and the social sciences, are awake, they're ready, they're finally recognizing this very deeply. Not all sciences, definitely not the sciences that are dominating climate policy and climate discourse are quite there yet, but the biodiversity sciences are. And I think all of us and all the legal sciences needs to be there too. So there's a part in that report of IPBS on transformational change, which is about the role and the experiences of human rights in supporting transformation, particularly the history of the protection and recognition of indigenous peoples' human rights, but also, again, children's human rights, women's human rights, peasants' rights, and nature's rights. So there's not full evidence, but this is the work I think we all need to do, fully understanding how legal sciences can be part of that understanding of transformation and meaningful engagement and learning from diverse knowledge systems. Through a sense of wonder, through art, and this is something I will return on in a minute, but this is partly how we need to engage more diverse cognitive skills that we have, and they are time and again numbed in all the decision spaces and many learning spaces we're part of. And the third element for me is that it might not be new, I think, for human rights lawyers, but it is still quite new for environmental lawyers, looking at the root causes of the planetary crisis as equity and inequity issues. The only meaningful thing in my experience that happened at COP29 in Baku last year was the release of an Oxfam report saying how the 50 richest billionaires on Earth emit as much carbon dioxide in 90 minutes as the rest of us do in a lifetime. And that was immediately picked up by the UN Secretary General, but made no difference in that space where we took no decision on mitigation. We took very little, if meaningful, decisions on climate finance, and where we had the highest yet level of corporate capture we've ever seen. And we've seen a lot already. And that was in the year, that was the hottest year in the last 10 hottest years, and the year where we clearly transgressed the 1.5 temperature guardrail, which is not keeping us safe, but it's at least giving us a sense of how much behind we are in turning the direction towards a safe climate. And so I think there's something for environmental lawyers to engage in much deeper thinking with human rights lawyers and indigenous thinkers and others working on transformation, but also for human rights lawyers to engage much more deeply in any worldviews and effort that tries to understand the collective dependence of humanity on those multiple interconnections with planetary health from the microbial level to the planetary level. And so let's connect, let's create spaces for mutual learning, for strategizing together, for transforming ourselves, because that's the only way in which then we can transform our relationships and lead to transformative change. And we can't do that only with rational, with legal reason, and even the best that we can. We need arts, we need play, we need forms to express joy and find joy and ways to express grief, and use all our imagination, empathy, hope to get there together, connecting those islands that are out there and are scaring the most powerful in very scary way, but they show that we are already on the right path somewhere, and we just need to be much more connected and maximizing that mutual learning as much as we can.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Okay, so I'll just react quickly and then turn it over to Elisa and Meg for quick reactions. One of the things that we'll be doing as the CHRDJ Forge team during the sessions is picking out through lines, cross-cutting themes. So we're actively taking notes. We have the whole team here, not just Youssef, but also Ashley, Melina, Joanna herself, myself. And what we're going to be doing is kind of listening into the conversations happening in the small groups and then saying, well, look at this theme emerging, right? And this, by theme, we don't mean an issue area like, rule of law versus climate change, but things like the ones that Meg and Elisa have beautifully already put on the table here. So I'll just give you two examples and then ask them to quickly react to those two points. One is this notion of islands of hope or creativity. You've used different terms. And this is, by the way, we didn't ask Elisa to make those comments in the way that she did, but this is why this is actually the third day of another conference we're running, which is called the More Than Human Rights and More Than Human Life Conference. So if any of us doesn't make any sense, we're sounding incoherent because we're very exhausted from that conference. And Joanna is emceeing that conference too, believe it or not. And this is why this afternoon, you'll be joined by 200 people from the other conference, right? So, but this is not just a matter of convenience, but from the beginning, ecological emergencies and human rights have been one of the central tracks in the work of Forge, and it's pretty prominent in the center. Different clinics and different teams work on ecological emergencies and human rights and global justice. But one of the themes that has emerged quite strongly in that other conference is biomimicry, right? The idea that one can learn from the processes of nature, that there are ways that intelligences other than humans have been solving problems for millions of years. So, and I once asked the founder of the biomimicry field, well, when an ecosystem is fully destroyed, right? Imagine after a wildfire, and we'll hear about that from Danny later today. How does nature come back? And she said, Janine Bennett said, well, little islands of life start popping up. It's not like life comes back spring like full bloom immediately all over the place, but it's here and there and there. And then a second generation, a second cohort of beings are the ones who take the responsibility for connecting those islands. So it's not the same generation, it's not the same group of beings, which in the human rights world means there's got to be generational succession. There's got to be passing on the baton, working with very different groups and types of beings in the field. And in this, so this is my first question to you both. You work with different islands of hope and islands of possibility and creativity. At this point, we find ourselves in need of protecting those islands. And this is what I understand you both do with youth activists or with lawyers and judges. But protecting them is not enough, because human rights cannot be just a defensive strategy. We cannot always be on the defensive. There's the need to connect them and then hopefully help with the mobilization of those islands in a forward-looking manner. So I wanted to ask you both, in your own, from your own points of views and your mandates, to speak to those themes of protecting, connecting, and mobilizing islands of hope and possibility.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think what I've been trying to do with the mandate, and it has been such an incredible platform to really make the legal argument, but also a scientific argument, that the lived experiences of those most affected by climate change should be the core of the evidence base for making decisions on climate change. And that I think is where we move not only from the defensive, the recognition and the need for protection of environmental and climate human rights defenders and those most affected, but also it's a proactive agenda, and it's a programmatic agenda of learning, of capacity building, of creating whole different spaces and processes where we can really listen to those lived experiences and learn in ways that then change what we each do in the positions of powers we sit in. The other thing that I've been thinking more about is how we bring some of the experiences of art-based research methodologies that I had the privilege to learn from some of my colleagues in the room, Dr. Dylan Megari and Dr. Pili Lembata from South Africa. How do we bring those examples of like human rights, art-based, multi-knowledge systems processes for change into UN spaces? We had some experiments in the past few years at the Climate COP, at the UN here in New York and elsewhere. And I can see how whenever I mention this, there's this lifting of a longing from everyone I'm talking to about, yes, let's create those spaces. We want to listen. We want to be able to activate all our cognitive capacities to imagine a different present that we're in. And all of us, again, we all have understanding of where a little bit of an open window can be for those experiments to happen, and all of us should bring in the people, those in those islands of hope and innovation that can have access and flourish in those spaces. And so I think the conversations like today, the work that we're doing in connecting among special procedures and others are essential, because again, we need to strategize together. Another word and practice I've learned from Dylan is political acupuncture. We have to find a map and together think about when do we solicit one point or another, and how that leads us forwards. So I'll leave you with that. Oh, sorry.
Thanks so much. I find this a little bit of an overwhelming question because it requires really to try to think in the generative space that we're all trying to do, which is hard when we're tired. But I think that, Elisa, you're absolutely right. The mandate is like a platform. I think it's a good metaphor. And the opportunities it opened depend entirely on who we're engaging with. And so one of the really exciting pieces for me has been to try to find ways where community justice workers in particular, or folks seeking justice from systems that are often very broken, exclusionary, slow, et cetera, can engage directly with judges and lawyers and have real generative discussions about how can we transform these systems to make them truly expand access to justice. And there is a discussion at the UN using this term people-centered justice. And so I'm trying really hard to ensure that that concept still has this breathing life and this beating heart, because any of these UN concepts can turn into absolutely nothing. And I think the only way to do that is by bringing in those voices that are coming from the grassroots. So I would say that. And then I would also say there are really amazing and exciting judges out there. So one of the things that's been a huge privilege to me is learning from judges who are really transforming the way they think about their work. And I'll just give you an example from a Kenyan judge who said, you know, what I try to do is think about, when I think about my docket, like what's on my docket, it's not just what's on my docket, but what should be on my docket. What are all the cases that are out there of injustice, of people who are having their rights trampled, but they don't have a way to get to me? And that's my job, to make sure that there are those pathways. And I think that those pathways are only found by looking at the grassroots, because those are the folks who are creating the pathways. And they're winding often, and they need resources, and they need energy, and they need care. And so I think connecting the folks who sort of have this power to transform the system from inside with the folks who are demanding that it transform from the outside is one of the most, to me, exciting things. And then I'll say, the UN is a frustrating place. I know I'm on video, so I'm trying to be very careful. I appreciate that. So I have to tell you, I am being a bit careful here. But you all know that, right? And so I think that using as much creativity as we can without getting that creativity like wrung out of it through the processes is so key. And so one kind of plea I will give to you is, we can truly be deployed by folks. And obviously we don't want to be manipulated, and we're going to do our work independently. That's absolutely crucial to being special rapporteur. But if you come to us and engage in a creative problem-solving manner, like, we have a lot of stuff we can do. We can really think outside the box with you. And I feel like I've really been able to do that in a number of places where grassroots justice actors and justice advocates are coming, and like, we sit down and we talk about how to do that. And so that's been also just like extremely energizing for me.
Thank you so much, Meg and Elisa. I think this has been a fantastic start to our conversations, and we cannot be more grateful to you both for having danced with us as we figured out how to make this as relevant as possible to everyone. So thanks, everyone. Please join me in thanking Meg and Elisa here.